Afternoon and a very, very warm welcome to this webinar series of Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. Um, Today's lecture is titled as Gender and Higher Education in India, COVID-19 and Beyond. We have the pleasure of having with us Professor Upasana Mahanta from OP Jindal Global University to speak on the subject. Professor Mahanta, she is at Jindal Global Law School. Her research focuses on the role of women in emergent political institutions, gendered understanding of conflict, women organizing and resisting in insecure contexts, and examining development through a gendered lens. The topic of today's lecture, Gender and Higher Education in India, COVID-19 and Beyond, is highly relevant. Gender and higher education in India, we know that there is a certain kind of lag as far as women are concerned in the realm of higher education. Of course, it is there even in primary education. But I believe that Professor Mahanta wants to argue that higher education is one of those areas where there is a suitable environment for taking care of this gender gap, whether in terms of enrollment or in terms of quality of education, or what the education actually teaches, that is the values, etc., norms, uh, which uh, which are taught and inculcated in people through the higher education system. And there is, of course, a connection with COVID-19 here, because as we all know that COVID-19 has turned our world upside down in so many ways. Uh, in most parts of the world, in the last 2 years, proper classes, which we have now started describing as physical classes or offline classes. So a new word has come up in a way. Earlier classes were classes, but now it is online versus offline. So they have been organized, and somehow the colleges, universities, and other institutions have continued their work. But the fact is that despite the best efforts of people around the world, a huge deficit in learning outcomes in in all fields of education has been created. So one of the questions that needs to be asked here is, has this impact been disproportionate on women? I think this is one question that might be explored by Upasana Mahanta on this afternoon. So with these very few words, I would now once again welcome Upasana Mahanta for this lecture series. And I also extend a very warm welcome to all our participants online, as well as those present with me here. And may I now request Professor Mahanta to continue with her, to proceed with her lecture.
Thank you. I hope I'm audible to all. Am I?
Uh, I The audio is not so good right now.
Okay. Is
Yeah,
that
it's better now. It's better now.
okay? Perfect. Perfect. I just wanted to make sure that I'm audible. Thank you. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and also so beautifully setting the context for the conversation. I call it a conversation because it is not a presentation. There is no PowerPoint to be shared. These are few reflections that I would want to share with all of you, those who are present online and also offline. Something that we are still getting used to saying, online and offline, but so sharing of a few reflections. And the second, of course, I would love to, this is a work in progress, so I would love to hear feedback, thoughts, your reflections on this, to be able to take these thoughts forward. As Mr. Ravi very beautifully set it out in the very beginning, there are three things that he has highlighted, which I would also want to focus on. He spoke about enrollment. He said that, quality of education itself, and, what is that is actually getting taught in the context of institutions of higher education. And I'll try and respond to all three of these thoughts that he has laid out at the very beginning. Before I do that, let me say what a privilege and an honor to be speaking to all of you, and to be part of this conversation series. I do hope that you will share your thoughts and your views on the reflections that I'm about to share. So, higher education institutions and gender. Now, this is not, a new concept or a new idea that I'm talking about. We have been talking about the importance of understanding, reflecting on gender and gendered spaces in the context of higher education institutions. So I don't want to go too much into the question of why gender, which of course a fundamental question that lies at the heart of this. But I am working with the assumption that there has been enough talked about, on the need and significance of talking about gender, or on the need and significance of interpreting the world in which we live through a gendered lens. There is enough also we have talked about, I'm sure, particularly in platforms like this, about how gender is constructed, and so on and so forth. So again, I am not getting into that conversation at this point. I'm happy if there are any questions regarding this to talk about later. But what I want to highlight, without getting into a deep conversation about what is gender, why gender, gender is a construct, and so on and so forth, I just want to highlight that gender, of course, is always present in our conversations, in our preferences, in our humor. It informs our institutions, it informs our belief systems, our actions, our desires. And I'm positioning my entire conversation based on this understanding of gender as informing our institutions, our beliefs, our structures, our actions, so on and so forth. And second is, I want to acknowledge that gender is, of course, not a concept to be talked about in isolation. It's an intersectional concept. So it is deeply interspersed with other categories of social exclusion, such as caste, class, religion, region, sexuality, sexual identity, so on and so forth. So these are the two things that I wanted to highlight at the very beginning. Now, higher education, the space of higher education, it's space that many of us inhabit. I have been part of the space in various capacities, right? As a student, as somebody who has taught and has been teaching since 2009, as someone who has also occupied certain spaces within institutions of higher education, particularly the one where I am currently a part of, in some kind of positions of leadership. So I'm trying to reflect on the thoughts and ideas from these positionalities that I have occupied at various points of time. And at the very core of it, before I begin, I want to ask the questions is, what is higher education? What is the purpose of higher education? So at the very core of it, the purpose of higher education is to, say, acquire new knowledge, or to prepare one for the workforce. But is that it? Is that the only purpose of higher education, or does it, no pun intended, but does it serve a higher purpose? As Nelson Mandela said, education is the most powerful weapon which we can use to change the world. So what is the space of higher education, and what kind of possibilities and challenges does it represent, particularly when we talk about gender? So that is just to set a context and framework for the conversation today. For instance, University Grants Commission has reiterated time and again that one of the ideals that they're committed to is that they're committed to promoting equity through higher education, right? And they want to promote an inclusive access to higher education. So I'm again this is still part of the context and the setting building. So higher educational institutions are not merely spaces to acquire new knowledge or to prepare one for the workforce, which of course is an important aspect of it, but it goes beyond that. It becomes, higher education spaces are spaces where you become incubators for thought leaders and social leaders of the future. So the creation of higher education institutions where norms of inclusivity, where norms of gender equality are practiced and modeled, where voices of all marginalized groups are valued and raised up. These become powerful tools for us, powerful tools available for society, for accelerating progress towards equality and empowerment of marginalized groups, of women and girls and various others gender identities. So the higher education institution spaces have the need and also the potential to be promoters of gender equality, to set up norms and standards of gender justice, right? But how far are they successful in doing so? Are they becoming, or are they promoters of gender equality and setting up norms and standards of gender justice? Or do they come to reproduce existing gender stereotypes and gender-based discriminatory practices? This is the question that I try to reflect on in this conversation. Now, before we begin to delve deeper, I just want to say that according to the All India Survey on Higher Education 2019-20, this is just to understand the range of institutions sort of that are there in India. There are 1,043 universities, 42,343 colleges, and 11,779 standalone institutions that All India Survey on Higher Education have spoken about. And 17 of these universities are exclusively for women. There are 3 in Rajasthan, 2 in Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, 1 each in Andhra, Assam, Bihar, Delhi, Haryana, Himachal Pradesh, Maharashtra, Orissa, Uttarakhand, and West Bengal. So this is just to give you a sense of numbers. Now, going back to what Mr. Ravi K. Mishra highlighted in the very beginning, that few things that needs to be addressed is the question of enrollment, quality, and what is being taught. So I would want to try to reflect on all of these aspects, albeit briefly. One, I would want to look at the idea of enrollment. Who is coming into the higher education institutions? Are we being able to address the gender gap when it comes to higher education institutions? How does this get translated into increased economic opportunities for people of all genders? Third, once we enter institution of higher education, what is happening? What is being taught? What is the curriculum? What kind of pedagogies? Is there a disparity in terms of career achievements of women who are, who are career academics or who are part of institutions of higher education in various capacities? COVID-19, the pandemic happened, the disruptions in terms of the teaching learning process that happened in the institutions of higher education, the technological revolution, but at the same time, the technological divide that sort of impedes access to higher education to certain groups, and particularly marginalized groups. Where do we go from here? What is the imagination of the National Education Policy 2020? And does that have the potential to address some of the challenges that we will be highlighting? So these are some of the things that we will be talking about today. So if you think in terms of enrollment, in institutions of higher education. Again, it has been, and I'm quoting the All India Survey on Higher Education 2019-20. The total enrollment in higher education has been estimated to be 38.5 million, and 19.6 million boys and 18.3 million are female. So women constitute 49% of the total enrollment. Per 100 male students, number of female students increased from 86 in 2015-2016 to 96 in 2019-2020. And in a very optimistic note, the All India Survey on Higher Education says that the number of women doing BA, BSc, MSc, and such courses have also gone up. However, the share of female students is lowest in institutions of national importance, followed by deemed universities, government and state private universities. This is what the All India Survey of Higher Education says. Now, yes, there are less women in certain kinds of universities, but the number of women in institutions of higher education has gone up. As I said, per 100 male students, it has gone up from 86 to 96 now in 2019 and 2020. Now, this is good news, right? This is a good thing that the number of women coming into the institutions of higher education has gone up. Now, because the number of women coming into institutions of higher education has gone up, then it becomes much more significant that that space becomes, oh, I can see the people who are physically present. Hello, everyone. So you can see how important it then becomes to be talking about, how gender equality is practiced and modeled in the context of institutions of higher education. Now, in this respect, I want to quote, so the number of women have gone up in institutions of higher education. That point has been made. Now, what's happening when the women have entered the institutions of higher education? Are they being able to, get a model of education that promotes gender equality? And are they being able to successfully enter the world outside and seek economic opportunities post completing their higher education? These are the two questions that I'm going to try to address. Now, one, all of you may be aware of the Saksham committee that was set up post the horrific gang that happened in New Delhi in 2012. The Saksham committee was set up under the aegis of UGC to look at the situation of women's safety in university campuses in India, and to talk about how university campuses can start talking about gender and sexual harassment at the workplace, and so on and so forth. The committee was chaired by Dr. Meenakshi Gopinath and was co-chaired by Professor Mary John. And and I'm quoting from the report, and it talked about how there was once the women have entered the institution of higher education, there was a lack of curriculum, pedagogy, in terms of research, in terms of innovation, that there is a gender gap. There is a glass ceiling. Both women teachers and non-teaching staff spoke about glass ceiling that operated at every level, how they had to fight for their privileges or their promotions. They spoke about how the curriculum, the pedagogy did not address questions that were rooted in issues of equality, that were rooted in issues of breaking existing gender stereotypes and norms. Right. They also spoke about how using the terms women and gender in a homogenizing way would be problematic, and how it was important to account for caste, regional experiences, and so on and so forth, while talking about women's experiences in the context of universities and colleges and institutions of higher education. They spoke about how the higher education institutions do not do enough to change the problematic ideas about gender and rights, that gender equality is not part of the syllabus in many cases. It is not openly discussed at many forums, which are attended by teachers and students, and that women students often feel inferior and do not speak in class or elsewhere. Because they do not feel the confidence to speak in these forums. So, on the one hand, we are speaking about increasing enrollment of women in institutions of higher education. And I'm talking about the lack of opportunities for all genders to be talking about gender equality norms in the context of syllabus, in the context of having open possibilities of discussing this in the context of institutions of higher education. So that is one of the gaps that I would consider you to reflect on, because the mandate of the Saksham Committee was to understand how claims of equality, dignity, and ability to live, work, and study without the fear of its harassment happen in the context of your university setup, right? So that is one thing that I would urge you to reflect on, is that on the one hand, we are talking about it, an increased enrollment. And while we should be rejoicing that, we should also be aware of how is it getting translated into creating equitable gender norms and conversations around equitable gender norms, syllabus, pedagogy in the context of institutions of higher education. The second thing that I want to highlight in the context of this positive development in terms of gender parity, in terms of enrollment, is that women, although they're coming into the institutions of higher education, okay, and getting their degrees and studying, it's not getting translated into female labor force participation. In fact, the female labor force participation in India has been steadily declining, right? According to one of the latest reports, the female labor force participation in India stands at 24.5%, while the global average is 45%. Right. 17% lower likelihood of married women in participating in the labor force in urban India, and 36% was the urban women's labor force participation role with a graduate degree and above in 2018 and 2019. So the other reflection that you to do in the context of institutions of higher education and gender is that while there is an increase in enrollment of women, and again, I understand that I'm reducing gender to women in this context, and I'm only talking about women, and I'll talk about the need to much more in this understanding itself. But I want to say that despite the fact that women are participating in large numbers in accessing higher education, it is not getting translated into labor force participation. Right, and there may be various reasons which are deeply rooted in structures of patriarchy, our understanding of work itself, the unpaid care work that women engage in, the need to look after families, sexual division of labor, the fact that women choose to opt out of paid employment once they're married and are having children. There may be various factors that have contributed to the decrease in female labor force participation in India, but that is very much a reality, right? And this is not only true of humanities and social sciences degrees. It is equally true in the context of STEM fields, which is science, technology, engineering, mathematics, right? And when you see the increased number of women's enrollment in the STEM fields, but a decreasing number of women's participation in labor force when it comes to STEM fields, you realize that it is not a question of skill and adequacy, that the question is much deeper and larger than that. Recently there was, not very recent, but in 2016, 2017, the Niti Aayog has done a survey where they found that, particularly in the context of women in science, and they found that 30% of the women who were part of the survey, they felt that their career affected family commitments and household responsibilities adversely. And 47% of the respondents cited family care as a reason for refusing a challenging opportunity in their careers, right? So while we can talk about, gender equality in terms of numbers of women that are coming in, we're not being able to translate that in the context of perceptions about gender role that women themselves hold very strongly to. The Niti Aayog report has talked about, amongst other things, how that female scientists had argued that to be able to work longer in STEM, they wanted age relaxation in eligibility criteria and extension of benefits like housing, transport, and medical health, as long as flexibility in their job contracts that allowed them more work-life flexibility. So the point that is a point to be reflected upon here is that how do policies that inform family and medical leave, work-life balance, and so on and so forth, which are rooted in organizational climate and culture, impact female labor force participation? And is the role of institutions of higher education limited to only is the idea of equality that we want to propagate to institutions of higher education is limited to increasing the numbers, or creating systems, environments, structural support mechanisms conducive so that this translates into increased economic opportunities and increased labor force participation for women? So that is one thought to leave you with. The second thought is about leadership and career opportunities for women within institutions of higher education itself, right? What do I mean by that? I mean that, academic career is however, and career is looked at as an individual pursuit, right? I have done my undergrad, my postgrad, my PhD. I've gotten into an academic position. So my career advancement is often being perceived as something that is very, very individualistic. But is there other structures of support that are required not to reinforce gender stereotype and workplace norms in ways that disadvantage some and others? And how do we understand this in terms of leadership positions within universities itself? Now, the University Grants Commission in its 2015 survey conducted across 431 recognized universities in India showed that there were only 30 universities that had women vice chancellors, and 6 of them were universities which were women-only universities. As of today, and there's a very nice piece that was written in Indian Express where many of the current female vice chancellors, the has to use female vice chancellor itself tells you the barriers that might exist, because as of today, out of the 54 central universities, only around 7 have female vice chancellors. The first female vice chancellor in 1946 was Hansa Mehta, and this first female vice chancellor at SNDT Women's University at Mumbai. as of now, there are 7 universities that have female vice chancellors out of the 54 central universities. The other is IIT Bangalore became the first institute in the country recently to set up a chair professorship for women. But in all of the major such institutions, you can see in terms of women's leadership positions, there is a huge gender gap. There are very few women who make it to senior positions in the country's premier institutions. Very few, fewer still would have, academic chairs. Indian Institute of Technology, IIT Bombay, again, I'm quoting from a report, has 25, only 25 out of the 143 professors are women, so 17.5%. And in IIT Madras, it is 10.2%, with only 31 out of 304 professors in the institute being women. Similarly, various prestigious institutions, IITs, Indian Institute of Science, and so on and so forth, has hardly or never had a woman director. At IISc, just one of the 9 chairs is held by a women scientist. The percentage of women employees in its administration is 17.6%, but number of women in positions of leadership are very less. Again, the All India Survey of Higher Education says that the total non-teaching staff male is 66.3%, as compared to 33.7% female staff. So again, when it comes to positions of leadership, positions of management, higher positions of leadership and management, the number of female is much less, or the number of assistant professors and associate professors and research associates, they're much higher number of women. But as we go up the ladder, the number of women keep getting reduced. So it is not only about women coming into institutions of higher educations to study and then falling out of the formal labor participation. It is also about the kind of work, kind of leadership positions that women are holding currently in institutions of higher education. And what does it mean in terms of creating role models, in terms of addressing this question of gender gap? According to the global gender gap report, which is prepared by the World Economic Forum, which was released in March 2021, it shows that only 29.2% of technical roles are held by women in India. India has fallen 28 places in its ranking and to 140, and despite the fact that number of women enrolled in STEM programs had increased. To increase employability or career opportunities. So these are, few of the questions as to how a wide constructions of gender are not addressed when we speak of women in higher education. So that is one thing. And the second thing, that the issue of higher education and gender is not only a women's issue. As I said, academic career, because it is, very, very individualistic in nature, it puts academics under pressure, that they're responsible for their own career advancement. But it's not, we must understand and engage with structures and discourses that sort of bind women in higher education setting. And if we want to make higher education truly inclusive, not only in terms of number of women coming in, but in terms of employability, in terms of women taking positions of leadership, institutions of higher education, then the conversation has to be much more reflective and nuanced. Now I want to come to briefly, I don't know how much time I have, because I really want to have enough time.
5 more minutes. 5.
Oh, that is very less. Okay, I will hurry up. I will just focus on two things that I think needs to be focused on. One is the COVID-19 and disruptions to higher education that has happened not only in India but globally. And Mr. Mishra spoke about it in the beginning, spoke about technology and the fact that all of us can do this. I can come in online and you all are sitting some offline and some online and do this. Talks about the massive technological revolution that got facilitated, accelerated due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And that has huge potential for higher education in India, innovation in curriculum, pedagogy, so on and so forth. But this is also true that, India is a country where there is a massive digital divide. So, and which impacts women disproportionately. And this is a question that Mr. Mishra wanted me to address. The 2017-18 National Sample Survey reported that only 23.8% of Indian households had internet access. So there is a digital divide as such. Right, but males are the primary users and they have primary access to internet. 16% of women had access to mobile internet compared to 36% of men. So there is a digital divide in that there is an urban-rural divide, and there is, of course, a gender divide in terms of having access. And there is also a divide in terms of caste and class locations and access to digital technology. So while COVID-19 and the kind of disruptions it created has new possibilities in terms of thinking in terms of technology and higher education, we must at the same time be absolutely cognizant of the disproportionate access to technology that is there, and how does it impact higher education, and how can we make it more inclusive, particularly for marginalized sections, including women. The second thing that I wanted to, just because I do not have time, but I want to touch upon that, is how in all of this, because all of us are talking in terms of the national education policy. So how does the national education policy fit into the conversation? So the National Education Policy 2020 has gender as a cross-cutting theme. Right. It talks about gender inclusivity in all spheres. It talks about, special education zone. It talks about a gender inclusive fund, which will include gender and socio-cultural and geographical identities and disabilities. And it also talks about that gender is not, it does not limit gender identity to women. It talks about transgenders as well. But what are the things that this national education policy will have to keep in mind, or we'll have to rethink, we'll have to think about much more critically in order to be able to make institutions of higher education much more inclusive. One, of course, that, much of its recommendation is to primary and high school education. I'm not getting into that. But when you talk about questions of higher education, we have to start thinking about curriculum. We have to start thinking about underlying understandings, the underlying constructions around gender. The fact that the number of girls who drop out of schools and colleges, and as per National Commission for Protection of Child Rights, is much higher between the age group of 15 and 18 for girls than for boys, right? So how does a policy, can the policy address these questions by talking about special economic zone and gender fund? Would it be possible to address the question of digital device, which sort of is so deeply in a country like India, the lack of female participation in jobs which are not rooted only in humanities and social sciences, but also in STEM fields, how to address the underlying questions of caste, class structures, which are deeply intersecting with questions of gender, and within that, then how to make equitable education available and accessible for all. So these are some of the things which perhaps we need to reflect on, even in the context of the national education policy, because if we are unable to do that, then we would still be treating, and apologies, it is not my own words, but a word that Nella Kabir used to talk about gender and development, but I'm going to use it here, that otherwise it will be like treating cancer with Band-Aid. So it's not like we can just put a Band-Aid on this and hope that it will heal, but it will have to take much more systemic, structural, nuanced, and intersectional approaches to be able to address the question of gender in the context of higher education. I will stop there, and I'm happy to have a conversation.
Thank you very much, Upasana, for your very comprehensive and interesting, insightful lecture. Yeah, we will now take questions.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Ma'am, I have 3 questions for you.
Yes, please.
What can be the solution according to you to control girls dropouting from schools due to COVID-19? The second one is your views on sexual harassment by the male supervisors to their women PhD scholars in higher education, because many scholars do not speak up, fearing to lose their PhD degrees. And the third one would be, please explain how the new education policy will help the girl students in higher education system. Thank you.
Can I just add one or two? Then
yes, please. I would like to take all of them together. Yes, absolutely.
Ma'am, your topic was supposed to be higher education, but I noticed that many of the examples that you gave were of school children and school education. So that is one disconnect that I noticed. And I wonder how useful it is to, cite statistics for the whole country. I was teaching in Delhi University, and when I started, there were 4 colleges which were only for boys, and the rest of the colleges were only for girls. So by implication, it meant that most girl students who get admitted to college at Delhi University. What has happened in the last 10 years is that those 5 colleges which were exclusively for men have also become co-ed. So actually in Delhi University, the space for boys to get admission has shrunk over the years. So I feel that, we have to take these individual cases rather than to cite statistics for the whole country. Now, as a result of all colleges being either exclusively girls' colleges or co-ed colleges, the number of jobs for women are disproportionately much higher in Delhi University than they are for men. So I think that I would like to bring this to your notice and ask for your comments. Thank you.
Shall we take one more set of questions? Please go ahead.
Absolutely. Please.
You talked about gender gap in universities or higher education. Do you have any data to compare India's condition with Western world or developed world? And second question, there is significant jump in percentage of female faculties in universities. And what is the reason? Do you have any data to compare what was the condition in 20, 30 years back?
Yeah, sure, I'll address that.
Please go ahead. I think now you can take up the questions.
I have quite a few. All right. Okay. I will take them up one by one. Let me first address, I'm sorry, I did not ask and you did not say any of your names. So I apologize. Won't be able to
this
answer.
Is Lipika Roy. She's a junior fellow here at Narendra
Okay.
Modi.
Hi, Lipika. And thank you very much for your question. It is a very, very actually significant questions to have asked. So I'm going to go point by point, okay, Lipika, to address your questions. Yes. What can be the solution to control girls dropout? Lipika, that's it's a very good question, but there is no one magic wand answer that I can provide. We have to also understand the structural impediments that exist in our society, which leads to dropout of girl students from schools and universities. And in that, actually, I want to tie up this answer to the question that ma'am asked. and about numbers and statistics in schools and universities. Ma'am, I don't know, perhaps I did not clearly stated enough. The numbers that I have quoted in terms of enrollment, in terms of dropouts, are all numbers related to colleges and universities. And as I said in the very beginning, that I'm not, although many of the things are equally applicable in terms of dropouts and others in the primary school education level, this is not something that I'm highlighting for today's talk. Why are there dropouts? Lipika, of course, there are structural questions about, sexual division of labor, what kind of jobs girls are supposed to be doing vis-a-vis boys are supposed to be doing. A recent study has shown that, parents prefer, and this is actually something that I would like to discuss in the context of the MEP as well. A recent study has shown that parents prefer to send boys to private educations institutions or schools at the primary level because they feel that they get a better education there, and girls are often not sent there. So what could be the possible solutions? A possible solutions could be perhaps to have, two levels. One would be to be able to understand compulsions on families, on parents, as to why they are unable to send their girl children to school or to universities. Universities' numbers are steadily increasing. It is more a question at the school level. In terms of dropouts, and I want to focus specifically on the institutions of higher education, the number of girls dropping out from institutions of higher education are higher than the number of boys, and number of girls dropping out of paid employment and formal employment sector is higher than number of boys. Now, why is that happening? There are a number of reasons that have contributed to it. One is the unpaid care work that women do, right? Women are the primary caregivers in the context of the family. So it is women who are doing the primary caregiving in terms of taking care of children, taking care of household responsibilities, taking care of the elderly, sick, so on and so forth. In the context of the pandemic, you have seen that there is this entire conversation that has exploded in the context of the unpaid care work that women provide in the context of the home, right? ILO report, which is a 2018 report, shows that on an average, women in India spend 297 minutes per day on unpaid care work as against 31 minutes by men. And in paid work, women spend only 160 minutes compared to 360 minutes by men. Right. Again, I know it's a bunch of statistics, but if you keep the statistic away, the basic argument is that women do unpaid care work more than men because it is the understanding that that is the primary responsibility of women. Right. So one of the ways of one of the solutions, one of the ways of retaining women, and I'm talking about higher education and in the labor force and economic opportunities, is to be able to break stereotypes around sexual division of labor, create structural support mechanism that enable women to do flexible work. I often make this argument, and I understand the paradox and dichotomy and probably somewhat hypocrisy in making this argument. But because if I say that there should be a creche in a place like where I work, there should be a creche so that the children are taken care of and I'm being able to devote my time at work. But again, that argument itself is counterproductive. There should be a creche, but perhaps it should not be only because women can leave their children, and it could be because parents can have institutional support structures for taking care of their children when they're doing their work. So what, unless and until a support structure in terms
if I may intervene, I think you will have to be a bit brief in the answer.
In my response.
There are many
Yes, you may intervene. We don't have time. So Lipika, I hope that answers your question. Sexual harassment at the workplace, not only by male supervisor, I'm talking about sexual harassment of the workplace, is an issue that has been addressed a lot in terms of institution support mechanisms that must be provided. I urge you to read the Saksham Committee report that addresses this question in a big way, talks about every university setting up internal mechanisms for addressing questions of sexual harassment at the workplace. I still understand that this is an extremely sensitive and difficult topic. It often becomes difficult for both women and men to talk about sexual harassment in the context of work, particularly in the context of the academia and institutions of higher education. There is more conversations required. There are open forums required. There is a whole set of recommendations that Saksham Committee gives, which I do not want to repeat because they are not my own recommendations, but they are very much to be incorporated in terms of institutions of higher education. Having compulsory courses, where we have modules and syllabuses around these issues in the context of institutions of higher education, making one aware of their rights, making the process much more accessible. These are some of the ways in which this can be navigated and addressed. How NEP help? How can NEP help? As I said, NEP has the vision in the context of institutions of higher education about creating special education zone or gender inclusive fund. It talks about making the space of higher education an equitable one, a gender inclusive one, and inclusive on various other parameters. However, NEP does not lay out a clear path as to how to achieve that. It says that it must be achieved, but the path how to achieve it is not clearly being laid out. So perhaps there are ways in which we can sort of take the NEP as the ground and work towards making these spaces more inclusive. NEP talks about, for example, flexible entry, bank of credit, multidisciplinary research-driven education, many of which, and since I do not have the time, I will not dive into that deeper, but many of this could become, possible ways of addressing question of, gender equality in the context of institutions of higher education. So this kind of flexible entry, exit, and so on and so forth might really help. But we have to think of ways in which this can be implemented in its true spirit. And given the current conditions, it is not conducive unless we have certain structural support mechanisms in place to be able to implement it well. To answer the question of ma'am in terms of, I hope the first question I already answered, that the data in terms of enrollment, in terms of labor force participation, in terms of women vice chancellors or women chairs in IITs and IIMs, in terms of faculty, in terms of teaching and non-teaching staff, all the data that has been used is pertaining to institutions of higher education, not about school education. I hope that clarifies it. Second, yes, as I said, that the question of women and gender is not a homogeneous question. I completely agree and acknowledge that, as I acknowledged at the very beginning, that it cannot be homogeneously applicable in all kind of contexts and settings. And it is true that in institutions of higher education like that of Delhi University, there are a lot of emphasis on, and there are women-only colleges. I studied in Delhi University in a women-only college, so I understand. I'm one of the beneficiaries of being able to access higher education through institutions like that. However, that does not take away from the fact that this is rooted in accessibility is rooted in questions of class, caste, gender, sexual orientation, so on and so forth. And two is that 24.5% of women in formal labor force as opposed to 40% globally is a very, very dismal number. So I think in that context, it is important to talk about it in a holistic manner. The fact that many of the women who are getting educated in these institutions of higher education are dropping out of the formal labor workforce are not seeking to be part of the formal labor force, and those who are dropping out at the time of marriageable age or at the time when they're having children, given the fact that they feel that the primary responsibility is theirs. The fact that women feel that there is a glass ceiling beyond which they're not being able to progress, the fact that there are only 7 female vice chancellors in India today, out of 54 central universities, including Delhi University. So I think these are some of the issues that require larger, holistic, nuanced reflections, and that must go beyond saying that, oh, but here it is working. I think it is important to go beyond that and talk about these larger impediments that exist, and ways in which this can be addressed holistically and in much more inclusive manner. And the fact that issue of gender in higher education cannot be, and as I said earlier, cannot be articulated as a women's issue only, and therefore how structural impediments prevent women for reaching, say, top leadership positions in higher education. How do policies that inform family and medical leave and work-life balance shape organizational culture and climate? Is there a way to think about promoting leadership norms or expectations that defy the kind of stereotypes that we have spoken about today? I think it is important to talk about these things. It's important to talk about how long-standing structures support and reinforce gender stereotypes and workplace norms in ways that then disadvantage some and promote others. It is important to have that kind of a macro picture of events. Any other question? Or do I have the time to take any other question? I have no idea.
There was one question about a comparative analysis with the situation
of course.
20, 30 years ago and with other countries.
Yes, I apologize because of the hurry. It slipped my mind. Yes, sir. Thank you for that question. There is, and I'm happy to share the studies. I'm not going to quote them because I do not have the time. But there are many studies that have been conducted, and I'm telling you one of the most recent ones, which says that the problem that we are highlighting in the context of India is not a problem unique to India or unique to the developing world. If you look at the Western world particularly, equity is achieved to a large extent in terms of, say, faculty ranks or classroom presence of genders, but parity has not yet occurred in the context of leadership. One of the recent studies that I have read, it says that the number of undergrad students have actually, women outnumber men in terms of number of undergrad students in the Western context, in the US and others. More women are again hired as assistants, professor positions, and top level leadership positions sort of end with women becoming chief academic officers. And so there is beyond that, the leadership positions have largely not gone to women. In fact, one of the recent studies have said that key areas such as in STEM fields, in the context of the West as well, in the top level leadership position, women are absent, and women have, despite showing individual and organizational skills, women have not been able to break through to that kind of leadership positions. So I think so there is a need perhaps in higher education particularly to move away from simply identifying the problem. I mean, of course, we have identified the problem, that A, B, C are the challenges, are the gaps, but it's also important to provide a frame of analysis and understanding and a frame of institutional change through structures and policies and norms and practices that will able to sort of address these questions of discriminations and disparity and disproportionality that exist in the context of institutions of higher education. I'm happy to provide, if you're interested, to provide some links to some of these studies that look at higher education and position of women, both in terms of leadership and so on and so forth, in the context of countries other than ours.
We have a couple of questions from here.
Yes, yes.
Go ahead.
I'm
Use
going
the
to just
mic.
sip of water, but please ask.
Yes, thank you for your lecture. I just want you to reflect a bit upon, the vision of the NEP and the danger of having concretizing the kind of gender disparity that already exists in higher education. For example, when we talk of flexible entry and exit points, it is in fact in some senses something which is billed as good for the students. But if you look at from the point of view of women students, especially women students from underprivileged backgrounds, then there is a danger that they're moving towards a flexible exit and entry is going to actually be detrimental to their job profile later on. It is women from underprivileged backgrounds who will get married first, or who probably the parents would not be willing to spend this kind of resources in sending the girl to college for 4 years, who will be asked to take up online courses, or drop out once and come back later on, etc. It will have a huge impact on their employability. And this is something that we have to think about, that despite the vision of an inclusive workplace and an inclusive higher education sector, what is going to happen in the kind of structural problems that we live with is that it is going to formalize something which we are all hoping to avoid and banish from our campuses. Thank you.
Can I address that, or is there any...
one more question?
Thank you, Madam, for your insightful lecture. The women education is very important, because women is the heart of, social structure. And we see our education is basically 140 in the world ranking. And then girl education is a problem. And if the girl is educated, she doesn't go for maths and science subjects, which brings innovation in the country, which brings prosperity in the country. And then even if a girl is educated, so then she doesn't comes in the corporate world. Bangladesh is a very, we think it's a very backward type of a country, but the women's strength in the corporate world is around maybe 60%. I was looking after in some of the, Twitter or somewhere. So my hunch is this, that unless and until a girl is given free education to be literate, to be a literate is an essential feature. To be graduate is an educated person. So if you are undergraduate, you are a literate person. But if you are graduate, then you are educated. So for at least, the education for a girl should be free, even for boys also. That should be a national education policy. Why don't we, propagate all these things which are very important and relevant in today's time? Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Is there any other question
or observation from my side, Upasana?
Yes, please.
You see, this entire effort to ensure what is considered as adequate representation, whether of women or of any other particular group, all that is fine. But the second aspect of education, which I had mentioned in my introduction, the quality aspect, that is a much more fundamental issue, you see, because what I observe is that in the last few decades, though higher education has become more participative, meaning that the groups which were not able to participate in it to a significant extent are now able to do so. It could be women, it could be people from comparatively deprived backgrounds, be it in terms of caste or be in terms of region, class, whatever. So that point is well taken. That participation has increased. Maybe it could increase further. That's a different matter. But as you yourself have said, that in many Western countries, at least, we see that in social sciences, in fact, women outnumber men at the undergrad level, certainly. And in fact, you may be surprised to hear this, but during my own student days, I came across in the West many boys complaining that education has become impossible for us. So, because once they, had sort of acquired a certain kind of age, even in the West, they were expected to be independent, they were expected to make money, and that was incompatible with receiving higher education, which, as you know, is very, very expensive in the developed countries. Of course, this would not apply so much to India, where higher education, because of the government subsidy, is comparatively very cheap. So there are many nuances involved in this. But leaving that thing aside, you see, what worries me is the fact that it is quality that has deteriorated steadily over the last few decades. And who is bothered about it? Hardly anyone, I will say. So, in the name of equality or equity or democratic participation, in effect, what we are giving is a highly diluted form of knowledge or learning or education to all our participants. It does not matter whether they are men or women or people from this class or that class, but you can see that more or less, if we leave aside a few centers of excellence and institutions of excellence, then there is a secular decline in the quality of education that we are giving in the higher institutions. So how do we address that while trying to increase participation enrollment? Because you see, the problem is, the fundamental problem is this. Some 7 years ago, when this new education policy was being considered, I had participated in a conference which was organized by the Ministry of Human Resource Development on quality, how to maintain quality. So I said, when my turn came to speak, I said, what is it that we are trying to do about quality? We are all talking about quantity here. Everybody, there were vice chancellors and very senior people, they were all talking about quantity only. So when my turn came to speak, I said, it is fine, but if we want to have quality, we will have to reduce quantity. Because in a poor country like India, there is no way that you can give both quantity and quality simultaneously, at present at least. And then everybody thought that how can this be? Because if we do not increase quantity, if we do not increase numbers, then how will democratic participation happen? So my point is that you cannot, eat your cake and have it too. So with the kind of resources you have, you can either have quality or quantity. So are we making a choice and saying that yes, we will have quantity, we are not bothered much about quality? Of course, we will continue to speak about it because it's a fashionable subject. So we have to say we are trying to maintain quality. And I remember one gentleman said that, our gross enrollment ratio is much less than that of United States of America. So I retorted, and I say it even now, that US was more prosperous than India 100 years ago. 100 years ago. So what is the comparison between India and the US? Are we not comparing the incomparable? I mean, the per capita income of United States today is something like $65,000. And India's per capita income, even in purchasing power parity, is just $6,000. So 8% of what the US income is. So are we not putting the cart before the horse when we try to, expand higher education beyond all practical limits in the quest for many objectives that we have sort of over the decades developed for ourselves?
All right. Let me address. Let me start with Ravi, your question, and then I will go backwards. There is no doubt, because there are a few things that I want to say about your observation. I agree that, of course, quality must not be compromised, and the focus should be on quality. There is no denying that. But I do not think that quality and equality are necessarily in conflict with each other. I do not think that we cannot ensure quality and equality of access at the same time, because that would lead to the assumption, and I'm assuming that is not what you proposed, but that would lead to the assumption that quality resides only in some, so the point is that, of course, quality is important. It is not a question or a debate about quality versus quantity, and quality does not necessarily have to be achieved at the cost of equality of access and opportunity. That is one response. The second response that I want to have is that that here I find myself in the same page as you, and that is exactly what I tried to argue through the reflections that I made, that this is not a question of how many people have enrolled in institutions of higher education. If I have to give you the statistics that, nearly as many women are there in institutions of higher education as men are, but that is not the point. The point is about what are they studying in these institutions of higher education. If a section committee report tells you that there are not syllabuses and curriculums and pedagogies that are inclusive, that are engaging with these concepts in a nuanced manner, so of course the quality is not there, and an increasing in quantity is therefore not getting translated into an increase in, say, female labor force participation, or increased number of women holding positions of leadership within institutions of higher education. So that is my second response. But at the end of the day, my third response to you is that, India is a country which is a country of numbers. Look at our population. There is no way we can run away from quantity. At some point or the other, we have to deal with the question of quantity and accessibility. So while making my first 2 points, I would say that we cannot, at the end of the day, completely ignore quantity. It is not a question of expanding the existing higher education institutions. I think we have too many, but we need to be able to empower them. The fact that even, ma'am spoke about Delhi University. I came to study in Delhi University from Assam. Right. And so many of us from India's Northeast come to institutions in Delhi, in Mumbai to study. So I think it is about also empowering state institutions, empowering institutions at the state level. Talk about the kind of quality that you were talking about in each of these institutions. Only then, we should be able to move away from this kind of a conversation and debate. I hope that responds to your question.
If I may just, add to this, when I talked about quality and I referred to this need or pressure for participation of more and more people, it is not about women alone. It could be any other group.
That was clear. Yeah.
See the point I'm trying to make is that perhaps it is better to provide higher education to fewer people, but at a level when they are actually useful for the society, to whichever group they belong to. But right now, because of the way the debate has been framed in the country in the last few decades, the contrary has happened. The focus of the entire policy, the focus of the entire system is on getting more and more people under the net, rather than trying to ensure that people who do get in to all the groups that they belong to, they are provided education at a minimum level. That's where the problem lies.
I completely agree. And perhaps this conversation does not, perhaps one conversation does not necessarily have to happen to the exclusion of the other. Perhaps a conversation about, because, if education is to be imparted to some, but quality education, there's this whole conversation that must happen, cannot run away from it, as to who would this some be, who would be this representative some. So perhaps these two conversations do not necessarily have to happen to the, one should not happen to the exclusion of other. I think it is possible to have both these conversations in conjunction with each other. The second,
I think we have 2 more minutes. So
2 more minutes.
Let us
Okay.
try to come up.
All right, I will try. One is Sir, your question about the importance of educating women. I mean, there is no doubt about it. It is important and it is significant. You spoke about Bangladesh. I'm not aware of that statistics, but I'm pleasantly surprised by it, and it's good to know. And perhaps we could look at models that have been adopted in South Asia and other countries where they have had success in terms of access, where higher education has also translated into access to formal employment and economic opportunities. Ma'am, I'm quite I apologize that I don't have time, but it's a very important question that you have asked, which is the vision of NEP. Does it unnecessarily conflict this flexible entry and exit? Does it make things more inclusive and possible, or does it actually would impede accessibility? It is yet to be seen, but I tend to agree with you that this flexibility in the education system, while it is appropriate to various needs and requirements, but the moment you leave it to choice, and we know the limited ways in which choice operates when it comes to certain kinds of marginalized groups in the society. So the idea of choice itself needs to be problematized in that context. So I concur and I resonate with the argument that you have made. The education system is not residing in isolation. It is residing in the context of the caste system and patriarchy and conservatism. So it is, one has to also understand that the choice does not become a facade to hide, the disproportionate access to education system. So I take that argument, and I hope to have a more broader conversation about that with you later. For example, in the NEP, it talks about how it talks about vocational education, and there's a line there that said that vocational education is perceived to be inferior to mainstream education, and meant largely for students who are unable to cope with the latter, and NEP tries to break that. But at the same time, while breaking it, might reinforce it in some way because of the way the idea of vocational education has been conceptualized. So I do not have time. I can see Ravi. But ma'am, I wish that I had more time to engage about this with
it has
you.
been
But
a
perhaps at some later.
very interesting lecture and enthusiastic conversation with all of us here, and we are really thankful for your presence this afternoon. And I thank all participants, all members of the audience, both online and those present in the hall. And of course, we will continue to have more such sessions.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for all the questions. And Ravi, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you once again. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.